Process by A. Van Vogt. Originally published in the December 1950 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Some of the anthologies and magazines in which it was republished include The Best Science Fiction Stories, 1951, in the year of its title, Fiction number 34 in 1956, and Galassia number 5 in 1957. Appearances in collections of the author's stories include The Far-Out Worlds of A. Van Vogt in 1968 and The Worlds of A. Van Vogt in 1974. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Process. In the bright light of that far sun, the forest breathed and had its being. It was aware of the ship that had come down through the thin mists of the upper air, but its automatic hostility to the alien thing was not immediately accompanied by alarm. For tens of thousands of square miles, its roots entwined under the ground, and its millions of treetops swayed gently in 1,000 idle breezes. And beyond, spreading over the hills and the mountains and along almost endless sea-coast, were other forests as strong and powerful as itself. From time immemorial, the forest had guarded the land from a dimly understood danger. What that danger was, it began now slowly to remember. It was from ships like this that descended from the sky. The forest could not recall clearly how it had defended itself in the past, but it did remember tensely that defense had been necessary. Even as it grew more and more aware of the ship coasting along in the gray-red sky above, its leaves whispered a timeless tale of battles fought and won. Thoughts flowed their slow course down the channels of vibration, and the stately limbs of tens of thousands of trees trembled ever so slightly. The vastness of that tremor, affecting as it did all the trees, gradually created a sound and a pressure. At first it was almost impalpable, like a breeze wafting through an evergreen glen, but it grew stronger. It acquired substance. The sound became all-enveloping, and the whole forest stood there vibrating its hostility, waiting for the thing in the sky to come nearer. It had not long to wait. The ship swung down from its lane. Its speed, now that it was close to the ground, was greater than it had first seemed, and it was bigger. It loomed gigantic over the near trees and swung down lower, careless of the treetops. Brush crackled, limbs broke, and entire trees were brushed aside as if they were meaningless and weightless and without strength. Down came the ship, cutting its own path through a forest that groaned and shrieked with its passage. It settled heavily into the ground 2 miles after it had first touched a tree. Behind, the swath of broken trees quivered and pulsed in the light of the sun, a straight path of destruction which, the forest suddenly remembered, was exactly what had happened in the past. It began to pull clear of the anguished parts. It drew out its juices and ceased vibrating in the affected areas. Later, it would send new growth to replace what had been destroyed, but now it accepted the partial death it had suffered. It knew fear. It was a fear tinged with anger. It felt the ship lying on crushed trees, on a part of itself that was not yet dead. It felt the coldness and the hardness of steel walls, and the fear and the anger increased. A whisper of thought pulsed along the vibration channels. "Wait," it said. "There is a memory in me, a memory of long ago, when other ships as this came." The memory refused to clarify. Tense but uncertain, the forest prepared to make its first attack. It began to grow around the ship. Long ago it had discovered the power of growth that was possible to it. There was a time when it had not been as large as it was now. And then, one day, it became aware that it was coming near another forest like itself. The two masses of growing wood, the two colossi of intertwined roots, approached each other warily, slowly, in amazement, in a startled but cautious wonder that a similar life form should actually have existed all this time, approached, touched, and fought for years. During that prolonged struggle, nearly all growth in the central portions stopped. Trees ceased to develop new branches. The leaves, by necessity, grew hardier and performed their functions for much longer periods. Roots developed slowly. The entire available strength of the forest was concentrated in the processes of defense and attack. Walls of trees sprang up overnight. Enormous roots tunneled into the ground for miles straight down, breaking through rock and metal, building a barrier of living wood against the encroaching growth of the strange forest. On the surface, the barriers thickened to a mile or more of trees that stood almost bole to bole. And on that basis, the great battle finally petered out. The forest accepted the obstacle created by its enemy. Later, it fought to a similar standstill a second forest, which attacked it from another direction. The limits of demarcation became as natural as the great salt sea to the south, or the icy cold of mountain tops that were frozen the year round. As it had in battle with the two other forests, the forest concentrated its entire strength against the encroaching ship. Trees shot up at the rate of a foot every few minutes. Creepers climbed the trees and flung themselves over the top of the vessel. The countless strands of it raced over the metal and then twined themselves around the trees on the far side. The roots of those trees dug deeper into the ground and anchored in rock strata heavier than any ship ever built. The tree boles thickened and the creepers widened until they were enormous cables. As the light of that first day faded into twilight, the ship was buried under thousands of tons of wood and hidden in foliage so thick that nothing of it was visible. The time had come for the final destructive action. Shortly after dark, tiny roots began to fumble over the underside of the ship. They were infinitesimally small, so small that in the initial stages they were no more than a few dozens of atoms in diameter, so small that the apparently solid metal seemed almost emptiness to them, so incredibly small that they penetrated the hard steel effortlessly. It was at that time, almost as if it had been waiting for this stage, that the ship took counteraction. The metal grew warm, then hot, and then cherry red. That was all that was needed. The tiny roots shriveled and died. The larger roots near the metal burned slowly as the searing heat reached them. Above the surface, other violence began. Flame darted from 100 orifices of the ship's surface. First the creepers, then the trees began to burn. It was no flare-up of uncontrollable fire, no fierce conflagration leaping from tree to tree in irresistible fury. Long ago, the forest had learned to control fires started by lightning or spontaneous combustion. It was a matter of sending sap to the affected area. The greener the tree, the more sap that permeated it. Then, the hotter the fire would have to be. The forest could not immediately remember ever having encountered a fire that could make inroads against a line of trees that oozed a sticky wetness from every crevice of their bark. But this fire could. It was different. It was not only flame, it was energy. It did not feed off the wood. It was fed by an energy within itself. That fact at last brought the associational memory to the forest. It was a sharp and unmistakable remembrance of what it had done long ago to rid itself and its planet of a ship just like this. It began to withdraw from the vicinity of the ship. It abandoned the framework of wood and shrubbery with which it had sought to imprison the alien structure. As the precious sap was sucked back into trees that would now form a second line of defense, The flames grew brighter, and the fire waxed so brilliant that the whole scene was bathed in an eerie glow. It was some time before the forest realized that the fire beams were no longer flaming out from the ship, and that what incandescence and smoke remained came from normally burning wood. That, too, was according to its memory of what had happened before. Frantically, though reluctantly, the forest initiated what it now realized was the only method of ridding itself of the intruder. Frantically, because it was hideously aware that the flame from the ship could destroy entire forests, and reluctantly, because the method of defense involved its suffering the burns of energy only slightly less violent than those that had flared from the machine. Tens of thousands of roots grew toward rock and soil formations that they had carefully avoided since the last ship had come. In spite of the need for haste, the process itself was slow. Tiny roots, quivering with unpleasant anticipation, forced themselves into the remote buried ore beds, and by an intricate process of osmosis drew grains of pure metal from the impure natural stuff. The grains were almost as small as the roots that had earlier penetrated the steel walls of the ship, small enough to be borne along, suspended in sap, through a maze of larger roots. Soon there were thousands of grains moving along the channels, then millions, and though each was tiny in itself, the soil where they were discharged soon sparkled in the light of the dying fire. As the sun of that world reared up over the horizon, the silvery gleam showed 100 feet wide all around the ship. It was shortly after noon that the machine showed awareness of what was happening. A dozen hatches opened, and objects floated out of them. They came down to the ground and began to skim up the silvery stuff with nozzled things that sucked up the fine dust in a steady fashion. They worked with great caution, but an hour before darkness set in again, they had scooped up more than 12 tons of the thinly spread uranium-235. As night fell, all the two-legged things vanished inside the vessel. The hatches closed, the long torpedo shape floated lightly upward and sped to the higher heavens where the sun still shone. The first awareness of the situation came to the forest as the roots deep under the ship reported a sudden lessening of pressure. It was several hours before it decided that the enemy had actually been driven off, and several more hours went by before it realized that the uranium dust still on the scene would have to be removed. The rays spread too far afield. The accident that occurred then took place for a very simple reason. The forest had taken the radioactive substance out of rock. To get rid of it, it need merely put it back into the nearest rock beds, particularly the kind of rock that absorbed the radioactivity. To the forest, the situation seemed as obvious as that. An hour after it began to carry out the plan, the explosion mushroomed toward outer space. It was vast beyond all the capacity of the forest to understand. It neither saw nor heard that colossal shape of death. What it did experience was enough. A hurricane leveled square miles of trees. The blast of heat and radiation started fires that took hours to put out. Fear departed slowly as it remembered that this too had happened before. Sharper by far than the memory was the vision of the possibilities of what had happened, the nature of the opportunity. Shortly after dawn the following morning, it launched its attack. Its victim was the forest, which, according to its faulty recollection, had originally invaded its territory. Along the entire front which separated the two colossi, small atomic explosions erupted. The solid barrier of trees, which was the other forest's outer defense, went down before blast after blast of irresistible energy. The enemy, reacting normally, brought up its reserve of sap. When it was fully committed to the gigantic task of growing a new barrier, the bombs started to go off again. The resulting explosions destroyed its main sap supply, and since it did not understand what was happening, it was lost from that moment. Into the no man's land, where the bombs had gone off, the attacking forest rushed an endless supply of roots. Wherever resistance built up, there an atomic bomb went off. Shortly after the next noon, a titanic explosion destroyed the sensitive central trees, and the battle was over. It took months for the forest to grow into the territory of its defeated enemy, to squeeze out the other's dying roots, to nudge over trees that now had no defense, and to put itself into full and unchallenged possession. The moment the task was completed, it turned like a fury upon the forest on its other flank. Once more it attacked with atomic thunder, and with a hail of fire tried to overwhelm its opponent. It was met by equal force. Exploding atoms! For its knowledge had leaked across the barrier of intertwined roots which separated forests. Almost, the two monsters destroyed each other. Each became a remnant that started the painful process of regrowth. As the years passed, the memory of what had happened grew dim. Not that it mattered. Actually, the ships came at will. And somehow, even if the forest remembered, its atomic bombs would not go off in the presence of a ship. The only thing that would drive away the ships was to surround each machine with a fine dust of radioactive stuff, whereupon it would scoop up the material and then hastily retreat. Victory was as simple as that. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.